Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Professor Jeffrey Sachs to discuss what seems to be the last hope of a peaceful settlement in Ukraine. We see now that Putin and Trump, they will initially agreed now to have another meeting to find a peaceful settlement. Budapest was the destination they seemed to agreed upon. But the reactions from Europe seem to have been panic, and this was contrasted with the great excitement when they thought Trump may send tomahawks, which could trigger, nuclear exchange. Since then, the Hungarian foreign minister has accused the Europeans of attempting to sabotage the meeting, and the meeting has now seemingly been cancelled, and you can almost hear the champagne corks going off across European capitals. It is quite a unique situation, given that we are losing this war. How do you make sense of this situation?
Well, I think the European leaders are dreadful, and they're failing. And we can start from the point of view that the greatest warmongers of our day, Starmer of the UK, Merz of Germany, and Macron of France, have the most tenuous hold on power and political authority within their own countries. They have approval ratings of about 20% and disapproval ratings of about 80%. And that's true of all three of these warmongers. So I think we can't quite make sense of it in the in a rational sense. These are failed politicians. They have a failed approach to this crisis, and so I don't want to rationalize their failure. It also makes it a little bit hard to understand this persistence in failure. What they have been recommending actually for 3 years, more than 3 years, since Russia and Ukraine nearly reached a negotiated agreement in April 2022, is continued war that brings no solutions for any of their own objectives. Europe is economically in a growing crisis. This war and the break of economic relations with Russia has led to a significant downturn and continuing decline of the European economy. The war is a huge distraction from what Europe should be doing to try to regain some focus on technological competition with the United States and China. Instead, Europe is completely obsessed with sanctions on Russia and with fighting this war. So the economics have not played to Europe's interest. But more than that, of course, the battlefield has been devastating. Since the break off of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in April 2022, Ukraine has lost territory, lost well over 1 million, and by some counts, roughly 2 million people to death and serious injury from this war. The demographics of people fleeing Ukraine are obvious and also devastating. Ukraine can't keep the lights on anymore throughout the country. So what is being accomplished by this continued insistence on a victory over Russia, that Ukraine will retake all ground, Russia will pay reparations, Russian assets will be seized, Russia will be brought to account, NATO will expand to Ukraine. In other words, every delusional idea which is impossible to implement continues to this day to be the view of these European leaders. And the public is having none of it, because none of it works, none of it makes sense. So you ask me why? I can't tell you why, except that these are failed politicians. Okay, I'll try to rationalize a bit why they think that, or they claim to think that it's better to fight Russia on the front line, so-called, and have the Ukrainians do it, because otherwise Russia will show up in Berlin or Paris or London. Uh, the only way Russia's showing up in these places is as tourists or possibly investors, not as troops. So the rationalization that's given, we have to stop Russia here, otherwise Russian expansionism will overtake Europe. That's a common meme, and you find it in some of the comment pages of the British newspapers and so forth. It's a nonsense. It's false. It's never put to the test through negotiations, but that seems to be the claim. Is there some hidden force of war profiteering that's part of this? I actually don't think so, that's fundamental. One might have said 3 years ago that Europe was just responding to U.S. pressures, and that seemed to be a viable way to understand Europe's warmongering. But with Trump trying to end the war one way or another, the continued European extremism on the war cannot be explained by the U.S. pressure. So I think that it is delusional, and of course, one more factor to be mentioned. Russia's frontline neighbors, the Baltic states and Poland, are, for historical reasons that one can maybe understand, although I don't agree with, are rabidly Russophobic. And there is a view in Europe, we must hold together, and so we must let our frontline eastern states dictate the European-wide policy. So there's a certain dimension of this, that this is just the way that Europe itself is holding together to let the most Russophobic voices speak. I mean, how else could one explain that Europe has turned its foreign policy machinery over to a vice president, high representative of Europe from Estonia, who is morning till night till morning vulgarly Russophobic, I would say, and completely antithetical to diplomacy. Of course, I'm speaking of Kaja Kallas. So uh, there's no true good justification for the European position. There are some explanations that may be behind what we're seeing, but these are failed policies. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, there's I've thought about that as well. If the Europeans would go away from the anti-Russian position as the unifying element, and they would start to walk towards peace, I think that there would be too many dividing lines. They might actually end up causing a lot of divisions. But that being said, given that the war is being lost and any deal tomorrow will be worse than today, the longer they postpone a peace, the worse it will be for the Europeans, I think. And also all the arguments that we're doing this for the Ukrainians, we're helping them. I mean, it comes into question when you see how all the Western media and politicians immediately will ignore all polling, which shows that the vast majority of Ukrainians want negotiations. But as this meeting now has been postponed or cancelled, the European leaders, if we can call them that, with Ukraine already has a 12-point plan being prepared. Again, this is not as a result of talks with Russia, because our leaders in Europe do not believe in talking to the other side. So these are unilateral terms. which is also a bit unique, given that the losing side usually do not get to dictate to the winning side. But on these 12 points, one of them is what you hinted towards, the legalization or the theft of Russian assets, or they say there can be a gradual unwinding of the sanctions if Russia agrees to use the assets we have taken to be used for reconstruction. So it's a way of having Russia consent to us taking their money. I mean, there's nothing there for Russia, though. I guess my question is, this is quite extraordinary but it's also consistent. For the past 35 years, indeed, EU strategies on Russia in the 90s, they're always quite unique, that they never had any input from Russia at all. How can you have this continuous agreement or proposals where there's no reference to any Russian security concerns at all? Nothing about NATO expansion or Ukraine neutrality.
Again, one of the European officials involved in this said in the press, I think it was reported in the Financial Times, that this is a repackaging of what has been said without anything new. Europe is simply perseverating. It's simply repeating the same points. The same with Zelensky, who rules by martial law against the overwhelming desire of his own country to stop this war at the negotiating table. So we're not seeing anything new. Maybe in terms of trying to rationalize this one more time, there was a view going into this provocation. It dates back to the 1990s, actually, when the United States laid out the plan to expand NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia, and for the European Union to expand to include these countries. Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 analyzed what Russia's response would be. And he wrote a book about this, The Grand Chessboard. And in his analysis, he said Russia would be extremely unhappy about all of this, but it could not resist this. The view was, in the end, if the West is strong and clear and perseveres, Russia will be defeated. And this may be also one of the implicit or explicit beliefs of these European leaders, that they somehow have Russia on the run, that it's about to collapse, it's about to crumble, the economy is about to fail, the battlefield situation is about to turn. All of this is delusional. And one of the delusions back in 1997 of Brzezinski, quite interesting because it's very explicit, and he was an analyst, and so he wrote down his assumptions and his predictions. He said that Russia would have no alternative because it would never turn to China, for example. A Russia-China alliance, he said, was out of the question. And he also said no one in the West would be so stupid as to make that happen. But here is Russia basically taking the viewpoint, we don't depend on following European diktats. We don't depend on Europe's goodwill. We don't even depend on the United States' goodwill, which is perhaps even more consequential. If Europe persists in this way, we will deal with the BRICS countries. We will deal with the Eurasian countries towards the east. China is our main economic partner. We trade with India. Between the two of them, that's 37% of the world population. We are a good standing leading member of the BRICS, which is nearly 50% of the world population and more than 40% of world GDP. We don't need the European Union to agree with us. And if the European Union persists in this one-sided, arrogant, and deaf approach, deaf in the sense that it has not listened to anything Russia has said since 1990, well, okay, we have alternatives. And I think that that also was and perhaps until very, very recently. One should also add Trump is a bumbling, uh, not well-informed, not very bright person, and so there is no clear U.S. position or U.S. strategy. I think there is a desire by Trump to end this war. He's ready to listen more, but the U.S. is also very inconsistent, and the Europeans uh, have found that by continuing their hard line, they bring Trump back into line. In other words, they've gotten this meeting in Budapest canceled just now. I think it is a European effect, which affected the White House. Trump is not strong enough, clear thinking enough, strategic enough to lead. So he's very responsive to the European pressures, and maybe the Europeans feel we'll just keep after this. After all, it's the Ukrainians dying. Eventually, Russia will collapse under the weight of all of this. This is wrong. It's profoundly cynical. It is against what their own publics want. It's against what the Ukrainian people want. But after all, how much confidence do you have in Starmer, Merz, and Macron? Their own countrymen despise them. This is the point.
Yeah, there's an amazing speech given by Joe Biden back in 97 at the Atlantic Council where he discusses NATO expansion, and he makes the point that the Russians have said if you decide to expand NATO, that would, well, effectively be betrayal. It would break Western Russian relations. And his response was simply that, well, we're the only game in town, and which is true, which was true in the 90s. And then he argues that the Russians told him that, if you do expand NATO, we're going to have to start aligning more with China. And he starts to mock it. He says, well, go ahead, I told them, while you're at it, why don't you go cooperate more with Iran? And the whole room bursts into laughter. And, if you forward, 28 years, not so funny anymore. It's, but we mentioned this on this topic of peace through strength. That this is something that NATO has, not just the U.S. but NATO has obsessed with for quite some time. This idea that if we're just powerful enough, this is the foundation of peace because we can dictate the terms. I was wondering how well if it does relate to it, but how do you
I
see?
think that there's another point that
Yeah.
one can add exactly in this regard, which is that perhaps another part of, maybe it's obvious, but then should be mentioned, therefore, that another part of the Macron, Merz, Starmer idea is not just that Russia will finally crumble if we persevere, but the idea that the Russophobia is our main political instrument for mobilizing public opinion in Europe to enable us to build a military that we don't have. In other words, we should use this as the opportunity. Maybe it is the opportunity to create the military and strategic autonomy of Europe. And so we have to exaggerate the Russia fear to bring our publics along. This may be a crude political tactic. We know Macron, he wants an autonomous Europe. By the way, so do I. I think it's the right approach. But maybe he thinks that to lie about it, to grossly exaggerate the threat from Russia is the way to bring it about rather than telling the truth. Well, Macron lies relentlessly. He's lied to me because he's said privately to me yes, NATO was the reason for this war, and then publicly exactly the opposite. And that kind of politics, uh, well, it can work for a while, but his approval rating is the lowest of all of them. By some measures, around 13% approval. And so, in other words, 87% disapproval. Um, and I think the public sense is that these politicians are not leveling with their citizens. They're telling fables for whatever reason, and it doesn't resonate.
Yeah, never let a good crisis go to waste. But well, yeah, my last question though is on the format of the peace agreement, because we see that this is widely recognized now to be a NATO-Russia proxy war fought with Ukrainians. That is, from Boris Johnson to Marco Rubio, everyone has defined this now as a proxy war. Recently, Trump even made the point that Zelensky is giving him some plans for an offensive they want, and he's considering whether or not he will approve it. So, we kind of moved past the pretense here, but then the format for negotiations, where Trump is the mediator, and I always have to make the point that it's not his war, he's a peace president. And I guess there's a positive attitude to, or a persona to encourage, even if it's profoundly flawed. But how long can this format continue, though? That is, to pretend as if this is not a NATO war, because if you don't diagnose it correctly, how can you solve it? I still don't hear any references to stopping the NATO expansion, restoring Ukraine neutrality.
Exactly.
And you do need to recognize that NATO is the participant. I mean, we did start or trigger the war in 2014. So how long can this continue? At some point, Trump has to also sit down at the table, not as a mediator.
Well, there's no mediation, and it's not even a proxy war, it's a war. NATO is at war with Russia, and it's not just NATO equipment and NATO financing and NATO intelligence and NATO targeting, it's NATO personnel, because very frequently you have American and European dead being sent back. We know that there are NATO personnel in Ukraine. There need to be with these weapon systems. This is not something that these are managed by the Ukrainians. This is perfectly known. So this isn't even a proxy war. It's true that most of the deaths are Ukrainian deaths, and that's what makes it so convenient from the point of view of the warmongers in the United States and Europe. But this is a direct war, and a very dangerous one, because it's a war between two nuclear superpowers, the United States and Russia. And when Trump talks this way, that yes, maybe we'll have the Tomahawks, or maybe we'll entertain a new offensive, that's a war between the U.S. and Russia. If Russia were having some Caribbean nation lob missiles into the United States, things would not be so calm in the U.S. But what the U.S. does vis-a-vis Russia is absolutely extraordinary and profoundly dangerous. So how long can this go on? It can continue to kill Ukrainians in very large numbers. It could escalate into something absolutely horrifying, or it could actually end sensibly the way that it should. But for that, we have to understand one last point, which is that Trump is a very weak leader, even not really a leader. He falls prey to flattery, which is part of the idea of the European plan, so-called, is to put Trump on as chair of some peace board. Like Trump put himself in Gaza. This is almost like a comic book. but this is also the European flattery. It's the Secretary General of NATO calling Trump daddy. Is this the real world of adults that actually have nuclear weapons, or is this some horrifying comic strip? This is the situation. We have a very inconsequent, uh, uh, unknowledgeable, and mercurial and temperamental president of the United States who demands flattery and adulation. We have European leaders profoundly unpopular. We have a pretty clear way that peace could actually be achieved, which is that Ukraine would be neutral. There would be a territorial agreement reached. There would be, on the basis of neutrality, a demilitarized region so that Ukraine, Europe, and Russia would all be safe from each other. And this would be the basis for peace from on the foundations of indivisible security. It's not hard to map this out, but it would take a bit of insight, knowledge, historical responsibility. And unfortunately, we don't have that in the Western countries right now anywhere. And so this is why we continue to not only endlessly circle around this and endlessly come up with absurd proposals, but why Ukraine continues to be such a devastating graveyard for Ukrainians day after day, week after week. And no Western leader other than Viktor Orban and Roberto Fico and probably a growing number of Europeans in the coming months, Mr. Babic as new Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. Maybe they'll finally be able to have their voice heard within Europe to say enough is enough. This has gone on far too long for our good and for our safety.
My concern now is if this window opportunity for a peaceful agreement closes, it looks like the only alternative becomes a direct war, though, because we see now a few days ago, FSB, the Russian intelligence services, released this report that it was the British who was behind the attack on their nuclear deterrent. We see now very openly that it's the Western countries involved in the attacks on Russian refineries. And of course, with the Tomahawks, there was no pretense anymore. It was recognition they would be operated by Americans. So not a Ukrainian weapon, but the American attack on Russia. So we're getting very close, it seems, to a full-out direct war.
And I could say there's delusions in all of the main capitals, in Washington, in London, in Paris, in Berlin. But the most delusional of all actually is in London because the British Empire still exists in the minds of these people. And when you mentioned these British-inspired attacks on Russian nuclear facilities, this is the insanity that continues to grip the long-gone British Empire.
Well, I know you have a big day ahead of you in the Vatican, so I will thank you very much for taking the time, and have a great one. Thank you.
Great to see you. Thanks.